hypothetical answers.
Yeah, you can give hypothetical answers. What would be, let's say we were somehow in the place of the people in Ukraine and all the stuff that's been going on over there. And let's say that it's been happening here instead of there. What do you think would be, what would be the hardest parts of dealing with all of that? I mean, the obvious or the not so obvious?
You seeing your family harmed and stuff like that.
Okay, seeing your family harmed, that's a good example.
That'd be the worst.
Yeah, that'd be the hardest thing with it.
Having to leave everything that's familiar.
Okay, having to leave everything that's familiar to you, not knowing if it's going to be there when you get back,
Right.
if you get back.
If you get back.
Okay, what else?
Not knowing if you're gonna be killed in the transition of leaving.
Okay, yeah, they're not even safe trying to get out of the country.
Yes.
So not knowing if you're going to even make it to the checkpoint to get out of the country, and then what?
Where are you going?
Yeah,
Where are you going to stay? Where are you going to put your head that night?
right,
What are you going to eat?
You're an orphan, really.
right. Basic needs of life, aren't they?
Yeah.
Type stuff, food, shelter, clothing, belonging, having family somewhere,
Not
Close.
knowing where your family
not
is.
knowing where your family is, knowing in some cases that you've left loved ones behind, like the men. So many of the men stay behind to fight.
Mhm.
A lot of them took their families to safety and then went back.
Right. Dropped them off and went back to fight.
Yeah, that's what Lana's brother did. He took his mother and daddy and grandmother as far as he could take them, and then he went back.
Okay.
And that was hard.
Yep. And let's say you couldn't get out.
That'd be sad.
Then what would be the hard part?
And watching, one time I seen them, they had this trench, and where they were dropping the boxes of dead people. And, not knowing where your family is buried.
Right. Not even knowing where you're buried.
Yeah,
And if you're burned or bombed out, you've got to find another place to find shelter. If you're fighting, obviously you're living in the field probably. And
Nighttime
yeah,
is scary.
yes, no
It's
power,
dark. No power.
no water, no sanitation,
Yeah.
no medicine, no refrigeration.
The way they do it, the Russians, they destroy everything.
Right.
I remember, it must have been a story I was listening to one time. They took over this country and they were tearing everything down. And the mayor or what it was of the town said, "It's yours now, why are you tearing it down? It's yours." And tearing down their own town.
Didn't make sense.
If they took it, they stopped,
Yeah.
They stopped doing it.
this one man that I listened to, he says that Russia don't even care for his own people.
Mm.
And he's telling people, you remember when we chose a word, hope, and I've got it written in my Bible. And he said, don't lose hope.
Right.
And he's telling the people,
Yeah.
just don't lose hope.
That's one of the major things that we have to have at times like that to keep us going. And I've shared, you've heard from the pulpit about the ones that survived the Holocaust. They were the ones that had something to look forward to when it was all over. They had hope. They had something to anchor.
Ukraine were tough, no doubt about that.
Yeah.
They're falling off now.
Yeah.
Running back out of the country now, they're going back just so they can reorganize and come back again. They're chasing them out of the country.
What if, hypothetically, it was your country and it was taken over? It was overrun. The war fighting was over. The enemy won. And you were taken against your will out of the country to another country, the attacking country or another country, and you're resettled there.
That's what they do in China, and Russia done that in Siberia. People they didn't get in trouble, or if they thought was trouble, they sent them to Siberia.
Right? Yeah. That's the last you heard of them usually.
Chinese do the same thing, they send them to resettlement camps. And when you stay there about 20 years and they figure, well, ain't gonna be no trouble, they'll let you come back, maybe. But a lot of times your family's already gone,
Yeah.
you're not even there.
Nothing to go back to that you remember.
Sometimes the wives are remarried and on the other way, so. Or husband, mostly men that get sent into those
Yeah.
camps.
Let's say once you get into that other country where they've taken you, you're not allowed to practice your religion. If you do,
You get in trouble. Yeah.
they could kill you or make life really difficult for you, even more so than it already is. And what do you do in those cases? Are you willing to die for that? Are you gonna sacrifice your faith? I mean,
I'm just saying, hypothetically, but that time, I don't think I would care.
Yeah.
What they thought.
Yeah.
You're gonna die anyhow,
yeah,
why even worry about it?
yeah, there's a good chance of that. Well, let's say once you get to that country where they've resettled you, you find out that you were living at a much lower level where you used to live in your homeland. Let's say you didn't have the economy, you didn't have any real chance of upward mobility, you were very limited where you were, and you get into this new place where they've resettled you. There's all kinds of opportunities for you. Even though you're there against your will, because they recognize your gifts, your talents, your abilities, they're willing to give you a degree of freedom, and as long as you
Abide by the
go along.
rules.
Yeah.
Go along.
Go along. Yeah. But if you do, you have a chance of having a even nicer life than you had at first. But they're going to still insist that you give up your faith. It would be harder under those circumstances, wouldn't it? To hold on to your faith?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, these are all hypothetical questions to us.
But in the Bible, that happened all the time. Look at all the people that got sent to other countries, Joseph and all of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Were sent to other countries and they come out,
Come out better than they went in.
Second command.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they came out better than they went in if they stayed with the Lord.
Yeah.
And He blessed them.
That's what Daniel is all about. That's all this scenario that I've been throwing out is really what the people of Israel had been dealing with and were dealing with in the 6th century BC when Daniel, or at least parts of Daniel, were written. And those that were taken out, and like Daniel and Hananiah and Azariah and Mishael, their Hebrew names. Actually, Daniel, it was his Hebrew name. It's interesting, he's the only one whose Hebrew name we remember. The others, we remember them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which were their slave names.
Lion, Floyd.
Yeah. Yeah. But they were much better off physically, and they had much more chances of advancing in their new environment than they would have had probably had they remained in Israel before the war. But in order to do that, they were asked or ordered to compromise their religious beliefs. And of course we know, we've read it enough times, we know how that ended up. In the end, in each case, God ended up being glorified, and those that stood for their faith ended up being rescued, and those that were blasphemous toward God were punished, and it worked out pretty well. I'm just going to assume that that's still recorded. Let me just. So tonight, as we get started, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the background for Daniel. And as you heard me say, there is some question as to who actually wrote the book of Daniel. The fact of the matter is, if it was actually written by Daniel, as it indicates in places, we don't know who that Daniel is. There's no historical Daniel to point to. It's not saying that he didn't exist. Not saying that he didn't write at least part of this. But we don't. If he did, and if he wrote it, we still don't know really who it was. Yeah. Other than what we can glean from what's actually in the book. So, but there's some discussion about it. Anytime we look at a book of the Bible, it's good to start off by figuring out several things. Who was writing, who they were writing to, what is the context or the setting in which they were writing, what's the context or setting that they were addressing, and any historical background or literary genre or whatever that might help to inform how to read this book. Because you don't read poetry like you read prose. Or, in this case, apocalyptic literature. You read in a totally different way because apocalyptic literature uses a lot of symbolism that has to be understood. Not just what it means to us, but what did it mean to the people who were reading it for the first time? What did it mean to the person that wrote it? Some of the symbols that they used. And obviously, if you're going to write, if I'm going to write a coded message to Karen, I'm going to use language that I know she understands. And she knows what I'm meaning when I say that. And hopefully, very few others, if anybody else, would understand, unless it's a group of people that I'm addressing. In which case, and that's what apocalyptic literature is usually about. It's sending coded messages to people very often in situations like what I've been describing. Some kind of a displaced group or an oppressed group. A group, think about Revelation itself. Obviously the most famous apocalyptic book in the Bible. It was written to a bunch of Christians who were under persecution. And it was written by a Christian leader who was Jewish in background. And so he uses a lot of Jewish historical references and literary references and symbols that only a Jewish person might understand and be able to decipher what the meaning is behind it. Matthew talks a lot about the Jewish aspects of the gospel, and he kind of interprets for those that are not Jewish what they mean. So Daniel is written in 2 different languages. The whole book is written in 2 different languages. Chapters 2 through 6 are written in Aramaic. And then chapters 1 and 7 through 12 are written in Hebrew. And the kind of Hebrew that is used, a lot of the words and phrasing and so forth, were not in use in the 6th century BC. They weren't in use until about the 2nd century BC. So it seems logical that if any part of the book of Daniel was written in the 6th or 5th century BC, it was probably those 2 through 6 chapters that were in Aramaic. And then the rest of it may have been written by someone in the 2nd century under similar circumstances and incorporated Daniel as part of that literary work, just to add to the message or the validity or the encouraging aspects of the second through 6 chapters. You know, if I'm going to try to encourage people going through a fight for freedom, I'm going to make a lot of references to people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and, you know, Abraham Lincoln, right, and all the people on Mount Rushmore, you know, and you'll know when I reference that. You know, I don't have to tell the whole story. If I mention Paul Revere, the Midnight Rival, everybody, hopefully, over 30 has heard that story. We'd like to think that everybody in America has heard that story, but so using or appropriating might be another way of putting it. Appropriating Daniel of those 6 chapters, 2 through 6, and incorporating that into another work that is written to another group of people going through a similar experience 4 centuries later.
To encourage them.
To encourage them, right. They're using perhaps stories that had circulated, perhaps verbally, since the time of the exile, or something that was written down and found later. However they came across it, there's a good chance, I'm not saying this is what happened, but there's a good chance that that's how the whole 12 chapters of Daniel came about. So, but, like I said, it would have been in similar circumstances. And the maps that I handed you earlier, you have a picture of the Babylonian Empire, which is top right on the first page. And you can see that it extends from the Persian Gulf all the way over to Egypt, down the Sinai Peninsula, and on the southern coast of Europe, Macedonia, in that area there, which I think is, some of that might be where some of the fighting's going on right now. And then you look down below that to the left, and you see the Persian Empire, which takes in all of that area. But as you see here, the Persian Gulf is the western or eastern edge of the Babylonian Empire, but in the Persian Empire, the Persian Gulf is pretty much central to the whole empire. And it extends even further west of Egypt over to Libya in that area today. Then you look on the bottom right and you'll see the Empire of Alexander the Great, which extends all the way over towards Greece and up into around the western edge of the Black Sea there, and most of northeastern Africa, including Egypt, and then all the way over almost into India, which is even farther east than the Persian Empire was, and that's the Empire of Alexander the Great. Unfortunately, Alexander didn't get to enjoy that very long. He got sick a short time after conquering all this territory, and he died. And after that, it takes a pretty, how would you say, charismatic individual to rule that kind of an empire, and they don't come along every day. And so when he passed away, the former Greek Empire was divided up, subdivided into different regions, and there's a little box there on the top of page 2 that shows you the Seleucids, which is pretty much the eastern majority of it was given to the Seleucids, and the Ptolemies were basically Israel, Lebanon, western Syria, over to Libya, and down through Egypt. Now that's important, these other two are kind of small and don't have a whole lot to do with Daniel. They're over towards Greece and Macedonia and Thrace, but the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, they kind of came into conflict with each other right in the region of Lebanon and Israel. And so they kind of pushed back and forth, and at one point, Antiochus IV, who was a Seleucid, decided to try to attack the Ptolemies in Egypt. And he failed miserably. He was embarrassed. And then he returned back to his part of the world. And the Jews, during this time frame, decided that, in response to part of what he did, they were kind of anxious and unhappy and unsettled. And so Antiochus decides he's got to basically remove from them their identity. The one thing that held them together more than anything else was,
Tribes.
well, yeah, but I mean religiously.
Oh,
It would have been the temple, right? Which had been rebuilt. And so he decided if he was going to destroy their sense of unity, he would attack their religion. And so
The way they always do it.
And yes. And so the way he chose to do that was to put up a statue to Zeus inside the temple, which of course the Jews found totally unacceptable. And that led to what is called the Maccabean Revolt in the 2nd century BC. And the Jews rose up and they actually defeated the Seleucids. And they, for a period of time, had their own country, their own autonomy for a period of time. Unfortunately, not long after that, these other guys came down from Italy, the Romans, and they put an end to that. So it was short-lived. But that gives a little bit of the historical context of in which Daniel was written. Whether it was written all in the 6th century or whether it was written all in the 2nd century or whether it's a combination, that gives you an overview of what was happening in the world in that 500-600 year window of time. Basically all the time that there's been Europeans on this continent. But that gives you an idea. It's a lot of change, really, in a few centuries. And then before the Babylonians was the Assyrians, which is legal here. They're the ones that took the 10 tribes out of the north into exile, and most of them never seen or heard from since. So, that's when it was written. We've talked a little bit about who did the writing, and we talked about the historical context and the dates. I think we've kind of covered that, unless you have any questions about it. I've told you pretty much what I know about it. A lot of this is the same stuff that I've summarized for you. The difference in the form, the literary form of Daniel, the first part is more or less stories, it's narratives that from chapters 2 through 6 that talk about, kind of in a storytelling mode about what happened, what life was like under Nebuchadnezzar and under Belshazzar and all of that, and the things that happened. There's another book that in the Bible that deals with that same time frame. Esther, one of my favorite books, deals with
I
that.
love the way she gets even.
Oh yeah, she's
It's
just.
his favorite book.
Yeah, it's a great story, but that takes you kind of behind the scenes a little bit to the inner workings of the palace and so forth, and it's a very interesting book that goes right along with this same time period. But like I said, those 6 chapters, 2 through 6, are written as kind of a storytelling prose. But the first and the last 6 chapters are more apocalyptic. It uses a lot of symbolism to represent things. And one of the reasons that some people think that 7 through 12 were written probably around the 2nd century is that the detail and the accuracy of the things that are depicted in the statue that we talked about at one point, the different things from which the statue were made. You remember? There was a head of gold, I believe, a chest of bronze, and legs that were a mixture of clay and bronze.
Or just clay.
Yeah, yeah. So you see the transition from the Babylonian Empire, which was very rich, to the Persian Empire that was very strong. And then you have the kind of the Seleucid, the 4 different empires, sub-empires, being the mixture of clay and bronze, I believe it is, which don't adhere to each other naturally. And that's the exact situation of those 4 different regions. They didn't adhere to one another, they fell apart. So that's one reason that some scholars think that at least those last 6 chapters and the first chapter were probably written toward the 2nd century because the depiction is so obviously symbolic of those different empires that had come and gone or were in the process of leaving. And so that when you know what kind of literature you're reading, it helps you to know, how to read it, how to decipher it, how to make sense and to apply what you're reading to yourself in your current situation, whatever that may be. I hope we never find ourselves in the situation that any of these stories were written, but we could. That was one of the questions. I had a whole list of questions I couldn't find here at the last minute. Was, one of the things that scares me, I think, about what's happening over in Ukraine is the thought that they didn't expect it. The Ukrainians were totally shocked.
He was going off he went off somewhere a few days, the president, Zelensky, goes to some kind of meeting somewhere, just a couple of days before this happened.
Just a couple days, and knowing that they were building up and
Yeah, I don't think he did go, but he was planning on going. One of those G7 meetings or something like that.
yeah, and when they did attack, they were stunned. And how many times did the famous last words? Well, that could never happen here.
That's, I think most of us was surprised.
Yeah.
I didn't think they'd go in and do something like
Yeah,
that. They'd already took over Crimea and parts of the north there.
and had not paid a price
Had a
for it.
problem, Georgia, they took Georgia, and Georgia has given them a fit. They left the government intact when they took Georgia. And Georgia gives the Russians a fit.
Yeah, still, yeah.
They don't like them. They voted people in, but they're still under Russian control.
Yeah. So, but that's one of the things that bothers me about what's happening there is that they were saying, oh, it'll never happen, it'll never happen. And we say all that.
All we gotta do is look around and say, 20 years ago, that'll never happen here.
Oh my, the stuff that has happened, right?
Just keep
In my lifetime, which is longer all the time, I hate to think about it.
Kind of scares you for your grandchild.
Oh, yeah.
I know it scares me for my great
You never thought if you didn't take a shot, they could take your job away from you.
Yeah.
You refuse to take a shot.
Isn't that a form of oppression?
You
Not
can't
to be
get,
political, but
Absolutely.
you can't even get a loan.
Yeah.
They're on your credit. Just,
wow.
I tell you,
That
if you
easy.
work for anything to do with government, if you did, you gotta fire you, lose your job, that's pretty bad.
Yeah, it's intimidating.
Yeah.
And That's a form of oppression. Well, one of the reasons that I talk so much about all of that is to overcome some obstacles that we have naturally when we look at a book like Daniel. It happens, 500-600 years before Jesus. That was a totally different environment, different people in that day were used to kings and harems and that type of thing, and the intrigues of the courts and so forth. This was all familiar to them, but to us it's like fairy tale stuff. We've lived in a democracy, a republic now for 250 years almost.
When they started here, probably over half the people didn't want to come out from under King George.
That's right. Yeah, it wasn't a unanimous thing.
It wasn't George Washington.
Yeah.
He didn't want part of it until he seen what was happening in the country. He needed to get out and take a side.
Mm-hmm.
He was satisfied with the king.
Yeah. And he could have been king if he'd have wanted to be, but thankfully he's kind of saw the light after all of that. What does the word apocalypse actually mean? Anybody know? It means a revealing or an unveiling. It's pulling back the curtains, like the Wizard of Oz, when the Toto goes and grabs a curtain and pulls it back, and you see
This little
the
man.
man behind the curtain. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
That's so funny.
Smoke coming out.
Yeah. But that's really, that's an apocalypse. That's a Toto pulling back the curtain is an apocalypse. It's an unveiling or revealing of something that's happening behind the scenes. And so Daniel, if you kind of look at it that way, even the 6th chapter or 5 chapters are narrative, in a way, they're still kind of apocalyptic in that they tell a story of what was happening behind the scenes in the royal courts and in the interaction between God's faithful few, though they may have been, but they were faithful to the point of risking it all, and the powerful king that all he had to do was say the word, a 40-foot statue and his likeness would be made of gold. They would heat the furnace so hot that it would kill the guards that threw the faithful Hebrew children in there. Yeah,
Can you imagine that?
Woo. Yeah, I bet that thing was glowing. I mean, that furnace was probably
That's why it's so cool.
About ready.
What happened?
yeah.
Absolutely.
And of course, we know they came out not even smelling of smoke. The hair on their arms were not singed, and even their clothes didn't smell of smoke. The only thing that burned were the cords that bound them.
We hear things like that happening around
Fourth
the
guy in there
world.
probably uncuffed.
And the fourth, yeah,
What did he say?
the 4th guy in there uncuffed him.
Yeah,
Yeah, Jesus had the keys to the handcuffs.
that's right, that's right.
You think about how significant that is that they didn't smell of smoke. The
We-
night of the fires
Oh,
here.
yeah, we had it
went
over
out.
there.
Yeah, we went out. Well, we went to Brooklyn's ball game, and Tim said, I smell like smoke.
Yeah,
No longer than we were out.
and I've been inside most of the
I
time.
stepped out on my porch. I mean, we're far away.
Yeah.
You can smell it.
Yeah.
It's
It
crazy.
smelled of smoke.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
here
don't
they,
know if that was from sheep back or from Tennessee.
that's probably sheep back because it was kind of blowing
Yeah.
this way.
That's right.
But yeah, I mean, here they were in the middle of the furnace and didn't smell like smoke. So I mean, they didn't smell like the guards outside the furnace smoking. Brutal stuff. Brutal stuff.
It was so cool that they were willing to make the stand. Why would we?
Mhm. Yeah, and it's hard not to jump ahead and get into that story because there's so much about it that we
Better
love.
stick to the beginning here.
But if we understand a little bit more where they came from, what they had dealt with, the changes, the fact of the matter is that for about 100 years or so, if that, they had a little bit of autonomy and self-rule. Out of those 600 years of time, that's barely the blink of an eye, really. And with that exception, they've been under domination from some foreign oppressor continuously. That helps us to understand the mindset of the people. Now, in Daniel's day, or in the 6th century, they didn't have that history. They had had hundreds of years of self-governance. They'd had, of course, they'd been fighting the Philistines and these other countries all this time because they kept dabbling in the idols, and God would remove His protection, and they'd be overrun, and then they'd repent.
I know, I've been reading through that, and I think,
Why don't you people ever learn? But we're looking at it, from a big bird's eye view.
yeah, we kind of see the big picture here,
Yeah.
They didn't.
They were in the middle of it. They were learning as they went. But let's see here. The author of this study says, when we read these stories, we enter the world of the underdog. It's easy for us to place ourselves in circumstances where everything seems to be stacked against us. We imagine that with the Lord's help we can overcome, just as these young Jewish men did. Their journey encourages us to stay faithful. However, if this is our only response to these stories, we do not fully comprehend them. While the modern reader, especially in the West, tends to read these narratives from a highly personal standpoint, the author's perspective is collective. These stories of Daniel and his companions express the plight and frustration of a powerless minority group. The Jewish captives in Babylon had no power to control or alter their circumstances, and success seems contingent upon giving up their identity. There is much that hangs in the balance. Success in Babylon might mean the death of the Jewish people and the failure of the God of Abraham, if they all gave in. And there's a reason that only a small remnant returned, because the majority were seduced. They gave up their identity for the comfort and the prosperity of going along with the flow. The difference, he says, between the Jewish exiles and the Babylonians was much more than a racial or ethnic distinction. There was a huge power imbalance. Babylon was the world power at the time, and the Jews were a conquered backwater. The only reason these Jewish men were in Babylon was because the Babylonians took them against their will. What standard of living the Jews had was because the Babylonians allowed it to happen. Babylon had everything, and the Jews had nothing. I don't want to just sit here and read to you, but any thoughts thus far as we begin to look into it? What time is it? I mentioned Antiochus already. I've covered a lot of this stuff already. All right, well, what similarities then do you see between the world that Daniel is addressing from the 6th century on to, say, the world of Revelation? I've kind of mentioned that already. What are the similarities there? Which group would identify with Daniel and his group from the book of Revelation? Who were the ones who were being scattered? Who were the ones who were being persecuted or hunted down or threatened, right? Being told you have to give up your religion if you want to survive.
Yeah, other countries, they're being martyred.
Right. And in some cases, different Caesars had different degrees of persecution against them. Some of which, if you didn't sacrifice to the Roman gods, they'd just throw you to the lions, literally. And it didn't always come out like it did for them, obviously. So there's a lot of similarities there. But what about for us? Do you in any way identify with those two groups as a believer today?
Well, we're being told what we can't say, what we can say. I mean, being on Facebook, if you didn't know anything, I mean, if you were just out here living, you weren't on social media in any way, you probably wouldn't even pay attention. But being on social media and seeing, you can't say that, or you're in Facebook jail, and stuff like that, you know, I mean, even if it's a true quote,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, like, the thing that silly that I went to Facebook jail for was a true quote from Hitler.
Hmm.
And it was a true quote. I mean, it was something I quoted 2 years ago, but because of Facebook memories, they go through and decide what's going to be in the memories, and I get little rebuttals from them from 2 years ago.
Good grief.
You know.
Well, they finally got around to you.
Yeah. And if I post something once in a while, they'll say, "You're being watched." I mean, it will let me know. So, you know, yeah. I don't want to stop.
So you're being intimidated.
Yeah.
Yeah, because then I think,
You
well,
have to
I
be
won't be able
careful.
I won't be able to put my devotional on.
Yeah.
If I, you know, I mean, I have a lot of people who read my devotions, you know, that I share each day. And I mean, and so.
I'm one of them.
So see, I mean, but I have a lot of friends like that I grew up with that didn't know Jesus or didn't go to church at all, and so they're seeing things, and then I think, oh, if I post, I'm gonna go to jail. You know, they'll put me in Facebook jail. But I still don't want to stop.
Right.
I don't want to be intimidated that way. I think that if it's something important, I try to figure out a way to put it on, even if I have to kind of separate the letters and the word
Yeah.
with a star or something.
Sometimes you change the letters to those, what
you
do
know.
they call them? Not emojis, but
Yeah.
ones above the letters,
Yeah.
the numbers.
Yeah, you try to do different things,
Wingdings, they call them.
you know, and
Yeah, I enjoy her sayings.
I mean, it's not I mean, it's just because of social media is so popular that's where we're seeing this, you know, don't say this, don't say that, don't say girl, don't say boy, don't say man, don't say woman. I mean, come on.
It's ridiculous.
Yep.
But it's gonna take people standing up. You know, it's like what's going on with Disney right now. I mean, they're pushing this transgender garbage to children,
Mhm.
and they are a part.
And they don't want to be told that they can't.
And they're part of the
That's what
sex
the part is
trafficking,
about.
and it's going to eventually come in.
Oh,
They're
yeah.
a part of it all.
Yep.
It's happened there. I mean, it's been embedded.
Oh yeah, they have had a lot of people be arrested that are that were pedophiles that worked for them. They've been having a whole lot, but if you try to share it, they take it off. You don't see it, or they move me way down.
Yeah.
Mhm. So nobody sees your stuff
Yeah,
anymore.
they don't
right?
see it until like several years, days from now, you know, and then I'll think, why has somebody just commented on that now?
Yeah.
It took me a while to realize what was happening.
Yeah, do you wonder if I mean, we going back to talking about the different time frames in which
Right.
this may have been written. Do you think it's possible that somehow Daniel or somebody wrote down all this stuff in that 5th or 6th century or 6th or 7th century and put it in a jar somewhere, like the Dead Sea Scrolls,
Right.
and somebody found it later on during the time of Antiochus IV, when the Jews were being oppressed by the
Yeah.
Seleucids.
They needed that encouragement.
And wow, it's like, hey, look what we found. This is what happened back then. And so hang on to your faith, because their very roots of their faith were being
Right.
altered.
Yeah.
When you put a temple or a statue to Zeus in the temple dedicated to Yahweh,
Yeah.
that's as much of an affront as you can make
Right.
to
Right.
the Jewish religion. And that was happening under their watch. And so obviously they chose, many of them chose not to accept that, and there was war over it. And in this one case, they won. They overcame because they stood up for God. And during that time frame, if I'm not mistaken, that's when the miracle of the lights occurred. The menorah, the candelabra. There wasn't enough oil to keep the candles lit. But somehow, even though there wasn't enough oil, the candles burned for all those 8 days when they should not
I mean,
have
when we look at
burning.
even where Jesus fed all the people, I mean, there was a need there. And when there's a need, God's going to come through.
Mhm.
That's right.
When we're trusting Him to come through for us.
When we turn to Him and trust in Him. Those people were taking the risk going out to see Him on the hillside because He was being watched by the authorities.
Yeah.
Not just the Jewish authorities, but the Romans, no doubt, were
They had
keeping
their
an
own
eye.
social media.
Yeah, they were, yeah. So, in our day and age, we're not facing necessarily expulsion from our country, but you could get kicked off Facebook. Or
My
other,
friends that have.
yeah, and other social media. I mean, there were big story today was Elon Musk now has a controlling interest or a huge
Yeah.
interest in Twitter that banned him.
10%.
10%, which is enough to get him on the board of directors.
I love what that's going on there. I think, go on.
Yeah,
I think he might buy
yeah, he threatened to.
it. $40 billion, he's almost got the money to buy it.
Oh yeah, that's pocket change for him now.
Yeah.
You know,
You know, he did over in Ukraine. They used his satellite because the Russians cut off all their,
Mm-hmm.
when they couldn't use phones or nothing, he used his satellite.
he put one up there so they could
He's already
communicate.
there, he's already there.
Yeah.
It's like,
Isn't that awesome? God makes a way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And He uses people you least expect
You
Him
least
to
expect,
use.
yeah.
And that's what's awesome.
And that's really part of the whole story, really, of Daniel, is that God is working behind the scenes in ways that we can't even imagine until we put ourselves out there. And it becomes necessary for Him to do something or we fail. And that's when it gets really exciting. Because that's when you know it's God. You don't have to ask.
I was watching Samaritan Purse, and he's in Poland, and they asked him, the news asked him if he had any trouble getting volunteers. He said, no. What kind of volunteers come from the states to help out?
Isn't that awesome?
Yeah.
It's really,
Yeah, that is one of the beautiful things that's happening in the midst of all of that devastation and injustice. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you this to take with you. It's a weekly guide to help you as we study Daniel together. Gives you daily instructions. Not sure how many pages this is. It's 5 days worth. It gives you there's a timeline there that shows you what we started off talking about, the different reigns of the different empires, rulers. And one of the interesting things that I've kind of learned already in the process of this is that Nebuchadnezzar, or Belshazzar, he's the one that, the handwriting on the wall and all of that. And he wasn't actually the king. He was a co-regent. He was designated by King Nabonidus, who took a 10-year hiatus from being the king and just appointed him as his replacement during that time
Well,
frame.
isn't that cool?
And yeah, it worked out. Didn't work out so good for the Babylonians. Didn't work out that good for Nebuchadnezzar? Belshazzar, yeah.
stressed out.
Yeah. But I guess that night just didn't care. He was off having a vacation somewhere. And he got his portion of the treasury and took off. But it was because of his absence that there was a lot of kind of political unrest in the country. Nobody really knew, well, who's in charge here, and well, who gives this Belshazzar guy, what gives him the right?
Sound like somebody.
A lot of finger pointing, and the army was demoralized, and the people were demoralized,
Which is happening here.
and when the Persians attacked, there was no unity. It was a cakewalk for the Persians, and that's why, Daniel could say to him, tonight's the night. You've been found weighed in the scales and found wanting. Scary words. Scary words. So we'll talk about that too. But we'll start with chapter 1, I think it is. Next week. Not next week. Next week. Yeah, we're doing the Thursday night Stations of the Cross and Tenebrae combined. We did that last year.
We do it on Thursday.
Start 6:30, just like we did here. And the week after that, Karen and I plan to be out of town. So we won't really get to this.
So we got 2 weeks to study.
Yeah, 3 weeks really from now.
3 weeks.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Might take that long as much as
Takes me
it
that
is.
long.
Take your time. I think once you get into it, you'll realize it's
Well,
not.
I love Daniel. I love the book of Daniel. So,
I don't think these assignments are really very taxing.
I know when I told my son, I said, this was one church, and he calls me on Wednesdays, when we chat on Wednesdays, when he's on his way home. And I said, Lord, I was in church, and I said, we're starting the book of Daniel. He said, I like the book of Daniel.
Who doesn't? And that's one of the things they start off saying, everybody loves the book of Daniel.
Yeah.
Because it's about the underdogs.
Yeah.
Standing up against the powers that be, and
I mean, what a good thing to study right now at this time.
standing against man and winning
In the United States,
and overcoming.
It's good.
And in the end, the ones that threw them in to the lion's den or the furnace end up praising the God that these Israelites worship. They're declaring it really is God. So God is glorified, and that's my favorite part
Yes.
of all of it. In the end, God gets the glory.
Indeed.
So,
That's a good thing.
let's close with a word of prayer. Jeannie, will you pray us out?
Heavenly Father, we love you and praise you. We thank you, Lord, for the opportunity we have to gather together to study your word. Lord, I pray that you would help us to understand it, to walk it out, to live it, not just study it, but to actually put it into play in our own lives.
Yes.
And Father, we do want to continue to remember to you those that are going through serious struggles in our church. We pray for Sue. We ask, Lord, that you would please touch her, please help her. God, you know what's happening there, and we just pray, Father, that you would just surround her with your peace. And Lord, I pray for Linda, because this is such a great burden on her. Having her husband sick and her mother-in-law sick, it's just such a great burden on Linda. And I just pray that you would just hold Linda tight to you and help her to know that you're with her. We do pray for good report for Dane when he goes to have his testimony. That they would say that he needs to lower what he's taken and not make it higher. Father, we love you and we thank you for hearing us. We thank you for the privilege to get together and to study your word today. We ask that you would be with each one of us here. Watch over us, protect us, and help us, Lord, that we will walk and please, our lives will please you. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
It was good to see Dane Sunday.
Yes, it was.
Thank y'all for joining us.
Bye.